Awesome, awesome. All right, let's get started. So, Dylan, if you could take away the share screen. My name is John Schleuss. I am president of the NewsGuild-CWA. We're a sector of the Communications Workers of America. I myself, not that long ago, about 10 years ago, didn't know what a union was, and really awesome members of the News Guild and staff and leaders helped me and my colleagues unionize at the Los Angeles Times, which was in 2018, January of 2018. And since then, I've been like dedicated to try to make our union better, was elected at the end of 2019. So really excited for this conversation tonight. Features a couple really awesome folks here. We've got Eric Blanc. He's a professor of labor studies at Rutgers University. He's author of the Substack Labor Politics, as well as the new book we're here to talk about tonight, We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing the Labor and Winning Big. Eric is a co-founder of and currently serves as an organizer trainer for the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. Welcome, Eric. Taylor Dolven is a TED Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado at Boulder right now. But she's been a reporter at Vice, the Boston Globe, and the Miami Herald, where in 2019, she and her colleagues built a union from scratch. She's also a current member organizer with the Guild and helping other workers join our amazing union. Today, we're here to talk about Eric's new book. It just came out. In it, Eric analyzes the wave. Here it is. Here's the book. Brought my copy here to Pittsburgh. But in it, Eric analyzes the wave of inspiring workplace organizing happening in places like Amazon warehouses, Starbucks stores, Southern auto factories, and in media workplaces. This worker-led organizing model builds the scale that's needed to unionize millions of workers. We've definitely used that scale here in the News Guild. We Are the Union provides the roadmap necessary for workers and unions to win really big. Eric's given News Guild members a discount. Just visit the University of California Press and use the promo code UNION50. And I will put that in the chat so folks can see it right now. Thanks so much for doing that, Eric. And Eric, being here tonight to talk to News Guild members, and we'll put this on our website and feature it later. But you've written about labor history. What makes the worker-to-worker model so different compared to other organizing approaches?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm such a fan of the Guild, and for people who read the book, they can see that one of the themes of it is like the News Guild is really good and is doing the type of organizing that other folks should be doing as well. And other unions similarly are kind of doing this model. But I would just say I'm a big fan, and so it's exciting to be able to talk to you all directly. Yeah, what makes it different? I think there's a couple ways of looking at it. The most immediate contrast of this model is with what I call staff-intensive unionizing, which is really has been the norm at least since the 80s, if not longer, in which the norm is you need one staff person for about every 100 workers is considered best practice. And so at its best, this model can be really effective. If you have a good organizer who's like oriented towards training up workers, that type of organizing can be really effective. It can build power. The problem is it just can't scale widely enough. There's just not enough money. There's not enough staffers. There's not enough time to use that kind of model to organize millions of people. So what I try to ask in the book is what would be the type of organizing that could win at scale in our current context, in which conditions really are different than labor's last big upsurge 100 years ago, in the 1930s. In some ways, I'm arguing for a return to kind of the spirit of the 1930s, in which workers took a lot of the ownership of the drives. So I'm arguing that that's possible again today, but it's going to take a lot different forms because, frankly, it's harder to organize today than it was in the 1930s in many ways because the working class is more atomized. So it takes a lot more fostering of social relations. It takes a lot more fostering of spreading the movement out. And so the book tries to answer, in our context, how do you do that at scale? And some of the crucial things that make the new model different than the staff-intensive model. It's not just that it requires fewer staffers, but that workers are strategizing over all of the big questions, not just the tactics. Workers have sort of a decisive say in strategy. Workers oftentimes are self-initiating campaigns. So a lot of times unions are giving tools to workers, or workers themselves organize before they affiliate with a union. So we've seen that a lot of times. The organizing committees will vote on which union to affiliate with, which is suggests a level of self-organization different than previous models. And then one of the crucial things, and I know this is something sort of near and dear to the News Guild, is that workers oftentimes are training other workers. So in a traditional model, oftentimes it'll be staff, people would be training worker leaders. Here, more and more, it's workers themselves who maybe have won their union recently, passing on their lessons, passing on the trainings they received to other workers. So those are, I would say, are like the defining characteristics of the new model, and it makes it it makes it scalable essentially.
Yeah, you mentioned the workers are like self-organizing. I think that's been like very common theme that we've seen when, we have a group of workers approach us and say, "Hey, we want to unionize, but we're interviewing you and other unions." We've seen that like a lot actually, which is exciting because I think it means that they already kind of have the smart questions in mind about, what kind of powerful union that they want to build. And they're approaching unions with sort of skepticism, but it's like a healthy skepticism to try to make the union itself better that they're joining. It's
And
really
it
exciting.
changes the relationship a little bit when you're relating to the union, the existing established union as a partner, because you have some solo organization. It allows for a more democratic process and more of a partnership process rather than a process of deference, which even despite like good intentions can happen sometimes if the workers think, oh, only the established union, the staffers have all the expertise. When there's a level of self-organization, it tends to be a sort of more fruitful partnership.
Totally. Um, Taylor, you've been a member organizer now for a bit. Like what drew you to the program inside the guild?
Thanks for having me. First, I just want to say how much that description speaks to my experience. I was actually on a committee in when we were forming a union at the Miami Herald in charge of interviewing the other union that we didn't end up going with. So we definitely were super skeptical, and I think that skepticism inherent in journalism and journalists really is why the worker to worker organizing model in newsrooms is so much more effective. But yeah, I've been a member organizer with the News Guild since 2022. As John had mentioned, had helped come together with my colleagues at the Miami Herald back in 2019 to form a union there. And so when Stephanie from the News Guild reached out to me about coming on board, working part-time to help other journalists take the steps that we did, I was just really excited about it. When we unionized at the Miami Herald, we also had a journalist, a full-time journalist working with us as a member organizer. And I just found it so much more helpful. As much as I love the staff, it was totally different to have someone who had literally been in our shoes and unionized a newsroom and gone through everything we were going through. So I just, having seen how powerful and helpful that could be, I really wanted to sort of pay it forward and help other journalists interested in forming unions and getting first contracts and taking the steps we did.
That's awesome, Taylor. I mean, that's the model we're going to talk a little bit about later on, but the learn, do, teach model that I think really has been built and created by a lot of members just trying to learn how to do something, then do it themselves, and then teach it to other people. Eric, I'm curious, appreciate all your love for the Guild in the book. You talk to folks on the West Coast, you talk to the New York Times tech workers. Tell us about other unions that you feature in your book. You look a lot at Starbucks workers and auto workers. Tell us about, how member to member organizing is really helping those folks.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's not just you all. And so this suggests that there's something deeper going on. It's not just sort of idiosyncratic to journalism. Because this is sometimes what people assume is that maybe there's something just in the water in media or in higher ed or something. But what we've seen is actually this type of model has been replicable in a whole host of different industries. So to give one example is Starbucks. Starbucks is a type of company that nobody had thought you could organize. No unions were going after Starbucks. The assumption was that it was just too big, too spread out, too many small workplaces. And, a small group of young left-leaning workers, Salt mostly, targeted some stores in Buffalo. And to their great surprise, they captured the imagination of baristas all across the country. Now, they had initially just thought they were going to organize a local regional campaign. They were trying to organize all the coffee shops in northern, sort of in the Rochester, Buffalo area. And all of a sudden, they were getting this influx of interest, and they had a choice there. If it had been a more traditional campaign, they would have just said no. This is a really common in labor unions, is pretty systematically saying no to workers who reach out because the workers don't fit into the pre-existing plan. And that, there's reasons for doing that sometimes. It can be costly to take on new drives. And there's all sorts of justifiable reasons why unions oftentimes say no, but it leads into excessive risk aversion. And fortunately, the Starbucks workers were not risk averse, and they said, okay, like new game plan is all of a sudden there's this potential for a national campaign, and they sort of unleashed the floodgates. They had workers talking to workers, and they basically just said, we're going to give you the tools that we had to organize, and we're going to ask you to start self-organizing regionally all across the country. And it exploded. There was 2 or 3 new union election filed every day for the first 6 months of 2022. It was just a wildfire. The full story of Starbucks I tell in the book, and so I don't want to it'd be too hard to go into all the detail. I would just say some of the big takeaways is that it was a combination of the bottom-up organizing with union resources that allowed them to continue despite the worst union busting sort of offensive in modern labor history. Starbucks really just threw everything they had to destroy these workers. It was truly a terror campaign of scorched earth, mass firings of workers, just systematic breaching of labor law. And yet they have succeeded now to the point where they forced Starbucks to the table. Starbucks actually wants to settle now. The workers don't want to agree to the proposal that management is making at the table, but they're at the table and workers want a higher raise. But just all to say is this campaign over 4 years has succeeded in forcing one of the biggest companies in the world to the table, the 6th largest private employer in the US. And they did that because of this bottom-up organizing, but frankly, also with the resources and support of Workers United and SEIU. So I do think that there's a lesson there of the possibility for combining the best of this sort of worker to worker spirit and leadership and structures, but with the serious backing of resources of big unions. Because I think to take on really big companies, it's going to require some combination of those forces.
I have to do a plug now for the staff and the organizers at Workers United because and I just put this in the chat. And Eric, I don't know, we haven't even talked about this, but the staff at Workers United, the organizers, haven't been union members themselves, and they just got voluntary recognition to actually join the guild and be represented by the Newspaper Guild of Philadelphia. So now they've formed their own union inside Workers United, which is really exciting. So it's exciting to become full circle on it. Like you've seen other examples too, like auto workers in the South. Like this is, I'm originally from the South. Like, Taylor worked at a Southern newspaper. There's this sort of like assumption that like I think that it's been kind of around that like, it's very difficult to organize in the South, but like auto workers are doing it. You want to speak about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, they won, for decades now, nobody's been able to win a union election at a major auto plant in the South. It literally hasn't been done yet. And the UAW did it just last year at Volkswagen in Chattanooga, and they won. This is a really historic victory, and they did it through a very bottom-up type drive. It was not a staff-intensive effort. They had one staffer for I think every 1,700 workers. Really, we're talking about a pretty worker-led bottom-up effort. And then it started spreading. They ran an election at Mercedes in Alabama that came close to winning. They lost, but the effort was close enough, and the workers are angry enough, and the bosses have lied enough since that election that they're going to run it again. They're expecting that they can win next time, and it's worth saying at Volkswagen, that was their third try. They lost the first 2 times, and so some of these really difficult context and these really difficult employers, sometimes you have to lose a few times before you win. And so that was the case in Tennessee, and I think it's going to be the case in Alabama. But you see then this bottom-up effort is really spread. The Alabama, the Mercedes workers, that you can't get more worker led than this, for good and for bad. It has its strengths and its limitations, but they were running the show. They were doing all sorts of sort of innovative tactics, some of which worked, some didn't. But it shows you that there isn't all sorts of workers are smart. I think this is really, maybe just a fundamental thing we need to understand is that there's just a basic intelligence of ordinary people that oftentimes gets ignored in mainstream, and people assume that, if you haven't been to college, XYZ, then, people are they're just like brainwashed by Fox News, or there can be a real contempt for working people. And what you see in these drives is, no matter what background, no matter what race, no matter what region you are, there is just something about working for a living that means that you have the possibility within you of uniting with your coworkers. Oftentimes it does take a support, and you're not doing it on your own, but there's this innate intelligence that can be brought out in through a good union organizing drive.
That's a really good point. I mean, you said it earlier that it's not just something in the water and media workers, it's something that can exist anywhere. I really, yeah, I completely believe with that sentiment that like all these workers just need like some information and some tools and some guidance, but then like have the ability to like lead their own movement. And myself 10 years ago didn't even really know the steps to forming a union. And I only learned that because other folks, showed me that way so that we could then build a union and then teach that to other folks. But I completely agree with that sentiment that there's just a lot of people who just don't know the basic steps to get started, but have the desire because their boss is crappy, their paid time off is horrible, their pay really sucks, there might be huge inequities in what people are paid, and they're just at-will employees. So there's a lot of potential. Taylor, I wonder, like, you talked a little bit about this, but give us some more benefits of the worker-to-worker organizing experience that you've had, and because some people are skeptical of this model. I mean, this is kind of like an undercurrent, but like, tell us the benefits that you've seen directly.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have the idea of a union as more of an insurance policy, like we pay dues and then we have this contract that's going to be there for us. Especially as having been at-will employees, finally getting a contract feels much more safe. But I think without a bottom-up organizing campaign and worker-to-worker organizing, it's really hard to sustain a contract and enforce a contract. And that's where I've seen the biggest benefit, is post-election, once you have a contract, really being able to hold the company accountable. We see companies violate contract provisions all the time, and unless workers have built relationships with each other that come with worker-to-worker organizing and are really sticking together and able to hold the company accountable for those violations, that unless they do that, the company really is just able to get away with even like changing provisions basically of a contract. So I think the long-term sustainability of a union is just really made much more much better with worker-to-worker organizing, when we realize, we are the union, like Eric's book title says, and that no one is going to protect us but ourselves, basically. And so I definitely saw that play out at the Miami Herald with our organizing campaign.
You find it's difficult when you're like now the member organizer, helping other workers unionize, like when you do that approach, like the thing you have to do is stop giving them the answers. Like you have to like kind of sit on yourself. Do you find that difficult? Like when you're like, oh, I know what they should do here, but I should just like kind of let them own this and figure this out and kind of nudge them in the right way. How is that difficult to you?
I definitely have to be reminded to do that. But I think maybe Eric would know this, but over time it just does feel like journalists are much more interested in taking this into their own hands. I think I would guess that if you polled workers who were unionizing in the News Guild, journalists 5, 10 years ago, maybe this wouldn't have seemed so natural. But the campaigns I'm working with now, I'm working with the Connecticut News Guild, and they are just totally, have totally taken charge. They run their own meetings, they set agendas, they come up with actions, they execute those actions. They're really just totally bottom up, with a lot of, encouragement and support and resources, like Eric said. But I think people are a lot more willing now to do the work themselves and see the benefits in long-term sustainability that I don't think you get if it's top down.
Did you experience that with other folks that you talked to, right, Eric? I mean, I'm guessing you did, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because one of the knocks sometimes of skeptics say of worker-to-worker organizing is, oh, you can't get first contracts. Like this is one of the things that you hear, and I think this is actually like a pretty weak argument. There's a confusion there. It's true that they haven't yet won first contracts at Amazon and Starbucks, but that's not because they were using a worker-to-worker model. It's because these are some of the biggest corporations in the world. So it just takes a long time to organize enough workers to bring them to the table. And it's not like other unions through more staff-intensive models were even trying to organize these companies. So that's a separate question. And I think Taylor's exactly right, is that in fact, the basis for having a strong contract that you can enforce is worker ownership. And this is really, one of the things that I knew before the research, but it really got driven home to me, is that one of the most irrational parts of the labor movement tradition right now is that the norm is that you have good organizing, or the norm is you have some level of organizing to win a union election, but then the norm is you pull the staff organizer away and then it goes to just a rep who's most of the time is not really like an organizer and who's overwhelmed and overworked and doesn't know the sort of the workplace to be able to build power. And so the actual power building tends to fall off after the union election, even though that's actually when you need to be ramping it up. And so this is something that the worker-to-worker model avoids because the leadership continuity is the workers. And I do think that Taylor's experience is actually entirely correct, that across the board, the places where transformative contracts are being won and enforced is where workers have real ownership of the process, not just for union election, but for the contract campaign itself.
I think journalists are also could be more open to this model because we are trained to be skeptical. And so when it's your colleague coming to you saying, I really think we should do this, this is important, and sort of laying out the case and the basics of how to, it's a lot easier to confide in them, to trust them, to agree to have skin in the game with them, than it is by someone from an institution as noble as the News Guild is. It's just it's much easier to open up to the idea when it's your colleague who's in the same workplace as you and going through similar, problems as you are.
I like avoided like just like completely guffawing or laughing out loud aggressively when you're just like, journalists are skeptical. We're pains in the ass. Like we are very difficult people. I remember when I met Stephanie Basile, our senior campaign lead on staff, who's interviewed a lot, Eric, in your book, We Are the Union. I was like, we have to get some things straight here. And I met her at a coffee shop and I was just like, don't use any of these like alphabet soup. Like, that's not something we do over here. And we've got these specific things that we need to do. And she was just so like, all right, well, let's get to work. Let's figure this out. And she was really good at modeling the behavior of, listening a bunch more than doing the talking and kind of nudging people to those collective actions and decisions themselves. But journalists, we're very difficult people, and I think a lot of really good ways, but it's a model that like I think definitely can exist for a lot of different groups. And we all love Stephanie so much, and all of our members. I put a link in the chat for folks who weren't watching that to the campaign that Taylor mentioned, the Hearst, Connecticut group, which went public a few months ago, is waiting for their election date to be called by the NLRB. They had to have a hearing over the makeup of their unit, so they're just waiting for that to happen. Folks, so if you click that link, you can follow them on social media and continue to support them. Hopefully that's going to be imminent, but we're also dealing with a situation where the Trump administration and President Trump has actually fired Gwen Wilcox, denying the board a quorum, which really kind of debilitates a lot of the function of the NLRB, which is it goes really to this point of needing more worker-to-worker organizing and building up to collective action so you can really put pressure on the company and not rely on outside forces like the NLRB in every single thing, but help focus on and support on the well union. Eric, like, you interviewed a ton of people, you surveyed a bunch of folks for the book. Tell us about like one of the most surprising or inspiring moments that you uncovered while you were researching.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good gig, honestly, to write a book like this because you just get to talk to a lot of workers talking about doing something really inspirational. And so I remember feeling kind of depressed about the world, but then I get these pick me up because I talk to workers. There's nothing like it to hear about people's stories. And so I hope you get that impression when you read the book. You know, you really do hear these sort of story after story of just really ordinary people doing pretty extraordinary things. The one that comes to my mind off the top of my head is the story I start with in the book. There's in the prologue, there's this story of Salwa, who was a Starbucks worker in Connecticut and who organized her shop while having stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma. And it's just really this remarkable thing. And it's interesting, like she didn't get any media attention about it. I think she was like even reluctant to talk to the media about it at the time because she didn't want to make it about herself. But then afterwards, I talked to her, it was a year later, and she just casually mentioned it. I reached out to her not even knowing this story. I reached out to her just because I was trying to talk to as many Starbucks workers as I can. She says, well, yeah, I was going through chemo. I was like, well, what do you mean? And then she told me this story where basically she would do her organizing in her car because it's the middle of winter. And so she was off work because she was doing chemo. So she wasn't at work at the time. So she would drive around town to meet with her coworkers, and she would had to be masked up because it was also the middle of COVID. And so she's putting her life even more at risk because her immune system's already very weak. But she felt that strong about it, so she'd be masked up. The other person would be masked up in her car, and she would be doing these one-on-ones. And I said, well, how did you do it? And she says, well, I would always do it right after they gave me the steroids. So the steroids, I guess she said, gave her a temporary bump. And she had this quote that just struck me. I had never thought about it this way. She says she compared uh, unionization to a certain extent of, or this is what she says. She says, when you have cancer, you sort of realize that certain things are out of your control and that what you have to do is use your time wisely, right? And she says, that's what she decided to do. She says to make the best of whatever time she had. She wanted to make it count. And so she decided to unionize her workplace, and and Salwa's fine now. So it's a happy ending. They won the union election. Salwa's like all better, but it's just remarkable that somebody in that circumstance, this is like really serious chemo. She didn't know if she was going to survive. Felt like the most meaningful thing she could do with her time was to organize her coworkers. And so, how can you? It's just like hearing things like that just give you a shot of hope in humanity, which I think is necessary this time because it can feel hard to feel that hope right now. But yeah, hopefully the stories like that in the book give us a little bit of sustenance to get through the hard sort of days ahead.
That's really impressive. And it does give you a shot in the arm. Taylor, I wonder, like, do you have like a moment when, you were working with the group, maybe it's like the Hearst, Connecticut, like diving into that campaign or another campaign, but like, do you have a moment where you saw the worker to worker, the member organizing program like really make a difference?
Yeah, I guess my best examples are probably from when I was the worker doing the worker organizing with the help of a member organizer and staff from the News Guild. But I think one of the biggest topics in our company's union busting campaign was trying to portray the News Guild as an outside entity. And because we had really used the approach that Eric's talking about, this bottom up worker to worker organizing, we had put in so much care and so much time in building relationships between each other that we did not have before. And because of that, it just didn't land. The argument that the union was something else besides us, just I don't think was very effective with our colleagues and didn't scare them in the way that I think the company really hoped it would. So that was like a huge benefit when we were going through captive audience meetings and all of that like really stressful time before the election. And then after the election, we just really rallied so quickly to enforce status quo. I remember pretty early on
Can
after
you
the
explain
election.
what status quo is, just in case
Yeah,
some?
so status quo, once you win your union election, basically your working conditions are frozen, for lack of a better word. And so, any changes to your working conditions that the company wants to make, they have to negotiate with you, the workers. And so because our newsroom had never had a union, this was sort of a culture shock for management, as you would imagine, that had been used to, changing job responsibilities, changing shifts, one day to the next. And so I remember pretty early on, one of our coworkers got an email that he was changing to a different shift. And so we didn't feel like we had to call anyone at the News Guild. We didn't feel like we had to um, involve anyone else. We knew exactly what to do. And we got together. We asked our managing editor for a meeting. We had a meeting that day. We negotiated a resolution that both the company and our colleague were happy with, that met the needs of coverage that we had, and also didn't ruin this person's life, and we felt like was really fair. And so to be able to do that so quickly and to mobilize so quickly to support each other and help each other, I just don't think that would have been possible if we would have had to call a staff member, get trained on how to do this. We were really able to execute on that and stick up for each other in a way that I don't think we would have otherwise.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, the terms like status quo and community of shared interest and all these things that you learn as you go through the effort, and then you're like, oh yeah, we know this. We've learned it. Let's empower ourselves. That's great. That's a really good example. Eric, there's a lot of chaos right now happening among federal workers. And I wonder if you could spend some time. I know that you've been spending a lot of time volunteering and supporting federal workers. Like, tell us about that right now.
Yeah, I'll just say anecdotally, I think, John, we had texted maybe right after the election, and you said something which I hadn't really thought about it this way as far as being hopeful. I said, well, God knows what's going to happen to the labor movement under Trump, and like I'm hopeful, but who knows? And you said in your experience organizing at the LA Times, there's something about the chaos of Trump pushing people to want to organize because it's something that they have control over, and then they want some sort of sense of collective stability and power in the face of all this chaos. And I never really thought about it that way. But that's certainly the case with what's happening right now in the federal workers. There's been a surge in membership in federal unions. In the last 5 weeks, over 15,000 workers have joined the federal unions, which is more than in the entire year prior. Actually, just for one of that's just for after the largest union. So you see a uptick because people, they see that they need a union because Musk and Trump are, they're wielding a sledgehammer sort of against the entire federal workforce and federal services. Um, I do think that the stakes of the federal worker battle are really high because if the administration is able to bust those unions, it's going to give them a huge amount of sort of political leverage to impose their will, even if it's illegal, using the sort of unquestioned um, willingness of the state bureaucracies to implement no matter what they want. So that's part of it. And then also, frankly, if they're able to bust those unions, very important unions, then that's going to set a copycat effect for employers all across the country. They're going to see, well, if Elon Musk can just tell the workers, leave if you don't agree with the new program, and everyone else, you're going to stay, do double the work for the same pay. Like, why wouldn't every management try to do that? And they will, especially if they think they can get away with it legally. So the stakes for the entire labor movement are really high. The good news is that workers have been organizing, and unions, to their credit, have been doing the legal route, and they're trying to block through the courts. But again, the real leadership in the federal workers movement has come more from below, from rank and file workers and from local presidents. Local presidents sort of they're organized in a new network called the Federal Unionist Network, which I've been sort of supporting pretty intensely behind the scenes. And they had a big day of action last Wednesday, had thousands of people out all across the country. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spoke in New York City. It's like very high energy. We had over 1,000 federal workers and allies, and the momentum was palpable. And I think we're going to need that public outcry because the reality is Musk's plans and Trump's plans are very unpopular, but there needs to be a lot higher sustained public backlash to force them to retreat. I think this is a winnable struggle because they've just done so much overreach. Even Republicans are saying, congressional Republicans are saying, what is going on? This is wild. And so it's going to be up to the labor movement, I think, across the board, federal workers, but all allies to go all in and say, an injury to one is an injury to all. We are going to fight so that there's no more layoffs. We're going to fight so that the federal services that we all depend on, Social Security, Medicare, just the NLRB, we need all of this stuff. This battle is our battle. So I hope that more unions sort of take up that spirit because it's not going to be like 6 months, 6 years. It's going to be like next 6 weeks, whether we, are able to defeat this. And so I do think that there's a level of urgency that I'm not sure every union has fully absorbed yet.
Well, it's sort of like, I think it's like kind of chicken and egg almost. Like, the News Guild was originally formed 91 years ago. And so there was a ton of organizing happening then. And about 20-ish or so years ago, the News Guild sort of stopped having like a lot of big organizing drives. And then, there was this sweet veteran reporter in the middle of the country who was like, I'm just going to start calling people at random newspapers and seeing if they want to form a union and just start randomly picking them up. And so that happened, and that started a bit of an effort with a couple of newsrooms in Sarasota, Florida, and then Lakeland. And then it just started taking off. And so do you see that as like a potential challenge that like some unions just don't really have it in their DNA because they haven't been doing it? But if they just start from a small place, like one Starbucks store in Buffalo,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, the unions are famously risk averse. So one of the nice things about this model is it doesn't hinge on the like national leaderships or even of big unions taking the initiative. My experience in a lot of these places has been that oftentimes it's workers from below take the lead and then the unions kind of catch up. And that's good. It's good for the unions to catch up. But at Starbucks, it was a similar thing. It's not that Workers United or SEIU launched this campaign. Workers took initiative from below and that they showed that it was possible in the same way as what you talked about in the guild. That guy showed it was possible, that there was interest. And so you do need to kind of have the spark. And it can be a small group of workers. It doesn't have to be everyone all at once. That is the way it goes. Oftentimes somebody has to be first, kind of to dare to do what seems impossible, and then all of a sudden afterwards it seems inevitable. And that is a hard part when it's not yet fully on board. If your union's giving you a hard time, there's a lot of unions that, frankly, that need to be reformed and that aren't dedicating the resources and support they need for unions. So in those cases, it's going to be a rank and file to start organizing and also to transform and democratize their unions. I do talk in the book a lot about that. Is that it goes hand in hand, the transformation of existing unions and the sort of transformation of how we bring people into unions. It's hard to disassociate these two things.
I think about that a lot. Like, in myself now, I've been the president for 5 years, and I'm, constantly like the huge benefit of like organizing and supporting organizing is that you're bringing so much new energy that can then like help be energy that fuels kind of further reform and further development of the union into a more democratic, more aggressive sort of like, we're not going to take those concessions again, because now we've got this new energy that like then feeds into groups that maybe in the union have already been long organized. And so, small example, new campaigns in, say, the News Guild of New York have helped kind of spur and benefit the contract at the New York Times, which has been long union, and then push even like the idea of like doing a short-term walkout. So, the New York Times a couple of years ago did its first walkout in decades. But that was started, really by, I think, like BuzzFeed News and almost a strike at Condé Nast at the New Yorker. And those folks had just just recently unionized. So it's like it's this total benefit, but then sometimes in the bureaucracy of the union, it can be someplace where like I think leaders can feel a little bit scared because they're like, oh, there's new energy here, there's some new conflict here. And so you have to be able to respond to that and actually lean into that new energy, which is really challenging, but like such a good thing. We've got time here now for a few questions. So if you haven't yet, if you want to put a question in the Q&A, you could also just drop it in the chat here. Would love folks to ask questions. I'm going to remind you too that you can get Eric's book, We Are the Union, if you order it through the University of California Press. You can use Union 50 as a promo code and get half off. Thank you so much, Eric, for that, and for our members. So get ready, put questions in the chat. I also want to flag the really awesome model which you include in your book and talk with members and organizers from the Guild, the Learn, Do, Teach model. I'm going to try to drop the link to the Learn, Do, Teach model in the chat as well. But this is something that members of the Guild have helped pull together that really emphasizes you learn something from another worker, from one of your colleagues, then you do it here. Don't know why I can't get it to zoom perfectly, but this is just a link to the PDF and kind of shows you a pyramid of the learning aspect, and then you're putting it into action. You're trying to actually use the skill that you do. And this could be, you know, something not as complex as like running an NLRB election, right? It could be small little things like meeting facilitation, right? Then you put it into practice after you learn it, and then you teach it to other people and try to build on that cycle. So we're trying to create a programmatic way of taking what you write about in the book, Eric, to really build that for News Guild members. And it's not like a perfect science, but it really, I think, has helped empower folks. Taylor here is a member organizer, part of the Guild's member organizing program. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a sign-up form. So if you're a News Guild member and you want to become a member organizer, there's different ways to be involved and different levels of being involved. So you can fill out that form or contact Stephanie Basile. Her information is in that form, and learn how to get more involved. So not seeing any questions in the chat. But if you got a question, you can put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A for Eric or for Taylor here. Eric, have you found that sentiment that, you know, I texted you about? I forgot that I texted you about the fact that like 3 weeks after Trump was first elected in 2016 was the first time that one of my colleagues, we had just lost our paid time off accrual at the LA Times, and it was just taken away because we didn't have a union and we didn't have a say in it. And like that was 3 weeks after the election in 2016, and one of my colleagues was like, we should form a union. And I was like, yes, tell me more. But do you find that like in that moment of chaos, that is anyone else starting to say that? Is it the federal workers who are really saying more of that? And that's why we're seeing like 15,000 people join
yeah,
Action?
we'll see. In the federal sector, it's clearly the case. Anecdotally, I can say that in EWOC, so the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which I'm really involved in, and I sort of helped get started, and I work as a trainer now, we've had the most amount of leads we've ever had. You know, even compared to early COVID or right after the Starbucks and everything was popping off, we've never had more workers reaching out to organize their workplace than we've had since Trump got elected. So is that generalized across the U.S. Labor movement? I don't know. I honestly don't know. All other things being equal, I think that it's not true that the worse things get or the worse things get, the better. You know, like I don't think that that's the way it works. It's just like things get worse and people fight back because the people fight back because they have their expectations raised and they feel like they can win. And so I don't think it's just things getting worse makes people fight back automatically. On the other hand, we have this very unique moment in US history where it's not just that Trump is here and doing all of this horrible stuff, but that comes on the sort of immediate end of this really significant labor uptick. You know, there's all of these young workers in particular all across the country that are sort of angry and that know how to organize. And it's a very volatile situation. It's not like Reagan 1981 where everything's on the retreat. It's really hard to know how this is going to go. All of the labor upsurge of the last 4 years hasn't just gone away. It's going to get channeled now into different organizing. And I think that there's a lot of people looking to organize their workplace as a mechanism to try to change the world in a moment where it's not clear that the Democrats have any plan for that, when it's not clear anyone from above is going to come and save them. People feel like saving themselves. And so we saw, it's again, maybe it's anecdotal, but the first ever union election win at Whole Foods under Amazon happened just a couple weeks ago under Trump in Philadelphia. This is like a really big win. Honestly, I thought they were going to lose because the company went really hard. It was just like a real boss fight. They terrorized the workers, fired a worker leader. It said that they were going to get worse pay. They gave a pay bump to everyone except for the union store, which is illegal, but they did it anyway. And so the workers won despite that. It's remarkable. After all of that, under Trump, under this no NLRB, bad NLRB, despite have the biggest company in the world, Amazon, do everything you can to tell you not to vote the union, they voted yes. Overwhelmingly, it wasn't even close. So, there's something there. There's something I do take a lot of hope from the generational piece. I think there's something about young workers in particular that are sort of raring to go. And so my hope and confidence is that that layer sort of across the board will seize the moment.
Yeah, I I've heard that too. I also I want to push back a little bit because it's not just young workers. I remember there's a lot of conversations with we just had a group at the South Florida Sun Sentinel win a union election. They're part of Tribune, which is owned by Alden Global Capital, terrible hedge fund ownership. And it's like a real, I think of a lot of newsrooms are like kind of double humped camels where you have a lot of younger people in their 20s and 30s, and then not a lot of people in their late 30s or 40s, and then more veteran folks who have been there for a very long time. And one of the boss tactics is to divide people by race, by gender, and by age. And so those veteran folks were really aligned with the younger folks who were being screwed over in different ways to form the union. So it's definitely an area where I think there's energy from a lot of the younger folks, but a lot of the older folks are just being screwed over just as much as them in some cases. And I definitely, have to give a shout out to all the folks who have been in the News Guild for a lot longer than I ever knew that the News Guild even existed, who helped us and others organize, because we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. Okay, we got some questions here. So I'm going to go, Lauren, first to you. Would love to hear more about how you think about building solidarity between unions and union members from completely different industries, states, et cetera.
I can chime in about this really briefly. My in-laws live in Argentina, and so I spend a lot of time there and have a lot of friends who are journalists there and in journalism unions. And I'm always so surprised whenever they do an action. The bus drivers show up, the people who pick up the garbage show up. Really, everyone shows up from all different sectors and industries, and it's something that I just haven't seen yet in the US for newsroom unions. That sort of industry solidarity, and I think part of it is the role that journalists historically sort of play in society as spectators and as people who aren't part of a community but are sort of outside commenting on the community. And so I think that history kind of makes this kind of solidarity that we see elsewhere kind of difficult. And so I'm so curious, John, what you think about this, or if you think it would benefit the News Guild and journalists to have more of this solidarity, and how we might be able to create that here.
It's a goofy thing. We try to remain sort of independent, right, from the people that we're covering. And so I think there's a huge benefit with thousands and thousands of journalists who have been unionizing over the last decade. it's helped them kind of understand how to tell labor stories, I think, better, because they've seen the struggle of organizing their own workplace, of fighting for a first contract, and now thousands of them going on strike. And so when they cover other workers doing that, I think that like helps them center and realize, oh, I've seen this line from the Starbucks CEO before, or the Amazon CEO before. Maybe because the Amazon CEO is also the owner of the Washington Post. And so it helps them kind of frame those stories. Another thing I'd point out, Taylor, and I was just on the call this morning with our strikers who have been on strike for 28 months at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And one of those strikers, Steve Mellon, who has been on strike for 28 months, has been covering the really devastating train derailment and toxic disaster in East Palestine, not too far from Pittsburgh. And so he's been writing about that and sort of the failure of the Biden administration to really like speak with these folks and stay with them, but then also for the Trump administration now to doing the same thing and not really being respectful of them. And in the last like few weeks, they've done something really amazing, which is they've helped organize like a food drive and food support, because steel workers, regular folks in Pittsburgh have stood up for the Pittsburgh strikers while they've been on strike. And now the strikers themselves are helping to organize food deliveries to residents in East Palestine who need basic things like food. So I think that like being part of the struggle is like a real element to like understanding, oh my God, like we're similarly all being screwed over together, but if you take care of me, I can take care of you, and we can build this kind of solidarity. Another question, Stephanie, who we've talked about here and is also in the book. Question for each of y'all, Eric and Taylor. In your experiences, Eric, in your interviews, and Taylor, in your member organizer, what's most surprised you?
Yeah, it's a good question. The thing that comes to my mind is the extent to which workers were able to effectively organize remotely. This is something that I frankly didn't really think was possible until the last few years, and particularly in the research on the book. I have these case studies of people who organize extremely effectively and had literally never met each other in their lives. They worked for like a company that was completely remote, and they were all over it nationwide. And even some of the companies that had in-person workplaces, like, so I have a chapter on Collectivo, which is a coffee chain in the Midwest. It's a pretty, significant number of workers, over 500 workers. This is spread out all over Wisconsin, all over Illinois. And they had an organizing committee in which, people lived hundreds of miles from each other in some place. And a lot of them had never met each other in person. Nevertheless, they were able to organize over Zoom very effectively over years and years and years. And it's funny, I have this quote in the book that actually they ended up having to cut it, that the worker didn't want me to use the full quote, but she says it was from it was actually a journalist. I think it was called the Public News Service, which is a private company, and they unionized, and she said, I've never met any of my coworkers before, but now they're all my best friends. And she had this additional quote, which I can say now, because she just didn't want it in the book. She says, and to be honest, sometimes I know too much about them. You know what I mean? It's like, these are people who are just like deeply intertwined, and it's amazing that that could happen over, online without that in-person interaction. And so I take again some hope in that people are able to find connection and are looking for a connection even if they don't have the physical proximity. Obviously, it's better in person if you can, but sometimes you can't. And so I think that's a hopeful dynamic, that even when we're spread out, there's something about human beings that want to connect, and something about union organizing that enables us to connect across those distances.
I'll chime in with what most surprised me from my unionization experience at the Miami Herald. I think so after we won our election and started bargaining, the company that owns the Miami Herald, McClatchy, went bankrupt and got bought by a hedge fund. And I was surprised just how well we weathered that. It was an incredibly tumultuous time, a whole lot of uncertainty about how we were going to, keep our union together and keep bargaining with this huge shift. And what really surprised me was just how relieved our managers seemed about the existence of our union. Because it really was like we were the ones who were able to really hold the line and defend our journalism and our newsroom amid this hedge fund takeover. And so just how well we were able to stick together through that and really like defend ourselves, I think was surprising. I had hoped that that would be the case, but it really was, and it was really inspiring.
Yeah, it's like lead with like good vibes and joy, right? Like organize with joy. And I think both of y'all are talking about that, right? Like that's the real powerful. And then it weirdly has like a benefit to the freaking company. That's the wild thing. Is like then it just makes the workplace better. Wow. Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour here. Eric, we are the union. Get it online today. It's really nice that you're trying to provide like an insight into how there's this other model that can really build a powerful labor movement, build powerful unions, and really build a lot of like solidarity among workers themselves who own their union. So thanks for researching it. Thanks for writing it. Thanks for listening to so many guild members for that research, and then bringing other amazing workers who can also do this, whether they're in a coffee shop or in an auto factory or wherever. They can all take this up. So thanks for coming tonight, and thanks for interviewing so many folks for it and publishing the book. Taylor, thanks for being an amazing badass member organizer, continuing to like teach other folks how to build fights and build movements and build campaigns that win. Y'all are both awesome, and everything that you shared tonight, I think, is something that we can just really take forward and continue to build a fighting labor movement. So hell yeah.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, John. Thanks, Taylor.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Eric.